Okay, let's start. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Ila and I'm a product marketing manager here at Windward. Welcome to our webinar, Beyond the Sea, Investigating More Than Maritime CDD. I'm gonna let the rest of my honorable panelists introduce themselves. Greg, you wanna start?
Yes, Hila, thank you so much. My name is Greg Pinn. I am the Director of Data and Strategic Partnerships at Windward, and I manage the Windward CDD programs and projects. CR?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sia Qureshi. I am the Business Development Manager for LexisNexis EMEA region, and it's an honor to participate today in this webinar and provide some information about our joint solutions with our partner Windward.
Julian.
Thank you, and I'm Julian Clark. I'm the Global Senior Partner of the law firm, international law firm INS. And again, it's great to be with all of you and with my colleagues from LexisNexis and from Windward today, and I hope we're going to have a really informative and interesting session.
It's great to have you all. And as the name of the webinar suggests, we're here to talk basically about why shipping stakeholders need to investigate who they're doing business with. And while it's always been around and maritime trade always involved some sort of sanction screening and due diligence in it, there's sort of a sense of urgency in the last couple of years to go even deeper into who is on the other side of your trade business. What do you think changed stakeholders' mind in that sense? Julian, we can start with you.
Okay, so I think you make a really good point, Hila, that sanctions has been around and regulation's been around for as long as shipping's been around in one form or another. Although for a long time we talked about trade restrictions or embargoes rather than using the phrase sanctions. And I started in the law about 30 years ago, and one of the first things that I dealt with as a very junior lawyer was the trade embargo against South Africa in relation to apartheid. But in those days, although there was a regulatory regime in place, it wasn't something that was on the center of your radar by any respect. And there wasn't really a huge demand, unless you were particularly involved in a direct trade, to carry out any significant due diligence. As time has gone on, what we've seen, and this has been a curve that has started off with a low increase, but then has rapidly gone up as almost like a thermal runaway that you see in some chemical experiments. So a really extreme growth in the extent of regulation and the demands for regulatory compliance. And what we've got involved in is this kind of crazy, massive game of passing the ball. You know, the ball fell on the financial institutions and the banks. But as the compliance has increased, and it's reached its peak in many ways with what's happened in Ukraine, where we've seen the widest application of international sanctions I think we've ever seen. What's happened is the bank have been passing that ball and just, you know, delegating and pushing down the chain, that obligation. And, you know, for the first time really over the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, it's really started to impact on the maritime sector, and it's a nowhere to hide system now. So I think it's been that combination of concerns and regulation that have really meant that this is now something that has to be right on the top of the agenda for anybody involved in maritime trade and transport.
And to add to that, I think there's been a lot of push over the last 10 years or so, really for financial institutions to focus more on trade-based money laundering. And that push towards TBML compliance, I think, is going to impact the key players in the supply chain market. We've seen this. We've seen sort of FATF and FinCEN taking a much more aggressive approach to non-financial institutions. We saw with the AML Act of 2020 pushing compliance onto art dealers and people involved in the art and antiquities trade. I think it's very, very likely that we're going to see that as well in the maritime trade as well. But beyond from just that direct requirement to do screening, we've also seen a huge push by OFAC in the last 24 to 36 months on advising institutions, on maritime institutions, on their responsibilities as it relates to maritime screening. We saw an advisory from OFAC in 2020. We saw a similar one soon after that in the UK, really laying out what are the areas that that maritime companies need to be aware of for what we in the maritime industry usually call the 180-day rule. As I'm sure many people in the call are aware, if you've got a vessel that's entered sanctioned waters for the last 180 days, those vessels cannot enter US or EU waters. Knowing who those vessels are, I think, becomes a big challenge. I'm sure, Julian, you are well aware of. But looking at things like falsifying cargo and vessel documents, ship-to-ship transfers, dark activities, that's something that I think many of us in the maritime space have been very focused on. What we haven't been focused on is uncovering other more financial, what we've historically been looking at as financially related areas of AML, of anti-money laundering and customer due diligence. And that is going to become a more and more key responsibility for maritime companies. I think.
Yeah. Sorry, go on, Greg.
I was going to say, if you look at where fines were, back when I think you and I were first starting to work in these sort of spaces, 20 years ago, the fines for AML were, less than $1 million on average. I remember when E-Trade was fined $6 million. That was considered unbelievably high. And now we're seeing fines in the tens of billions of dollars for AML. And maritime is now where financial risk was back then in the last 10, 15 years. And I think what we're going to see is that the increase in these fines is going to be a lot faster than what we saw in the financial space.
Yeah, Greg, I was just going to say that I totally agree with you, and that as the procedure and regulatory burden has increased, so has the complexity of the evasion. If I go back again to my first examples of embargoes against the apartheid regime in South Africa, that the way that was evaded was pretty basic and transparent. There was a trade known as the red acorn trade, where bills of lading would carry a little stamped red acorn in the top right-hand corner of the bill of lading, and it would say ship from Mozambique. But if it got a red acorn in it, everybody pretty much knew in the trade that it was a South African embargo breaking trade. It ain't that transparent and basic anymore. What's happened now is, as the regulations increased, the evasion techniques have become incredibly complex. And so it really creates, on the one hand, you've got this perfect storm, really. You've got this increased regulatory burden on the people at the sharp end of maritime trade, combined with a really, really difficult, maze to try and get yourself through and see exactly, whether or not there is some sort of evasion going on. Who are the counterparties? CR, it's that type of thing that you're seeing as well.
Yeah, you and Greg pointed some really good areas. Myself being also a certified money laundering specialist, I think I can see that in today's rapidly, changing regulatory environment, it's basically increasingly difficult to effectively manage risk and meet the turnaround demands in the maritime sector. Also, if we see, for example, how the OFAC, sanction advisory is changing the maritime industry for good. So when OFAC and the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Coast Guard issued, their long-awaited maritime sanction advisory a year ago, it was a landmark moment. So what it means is that the guidance was the first one to target the wider maritime industry. So it sought, to make clear that the burden of responsibility for sanction compliance only lies, with everyone, across the supply chain, and really stress, the need for the private sector to plug, money holes currently used to, avoid sanctions. So the advisory basically become instantly important for all those with exposure to maritime, trade. Also, if we look at the 40 recommendation, so recommendation number 10, for example, is about the due diligence or customer due diligence standards, which consist of, ADD as well. And also recommendation number 12 is the politically exposed person who you're dealing with. So this means while non-binding, there was a clear message to ship owners, operators, managers, port shippers, freight forwarders, community traders, and including, insurers and financial institutions. So they must improve their compliance programs to avoid breaching use sanctions, which means they need to put in place also a good, screening solutions with the data or face, the consequences, as Greg mentioned there, that 20 years back, the average fines was less than $1 million. But if we see now, that's extremely high. It's not only about the fine, but also the reputation. So very quickly, I would say other global, regulators, feel in the same line. Like such as the UK Office of Financial, Sanctions Implementations. Recently, they put a lot of, pressure because obviously before we could see that the sanctions, especially in the maritime space, like we had like Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, all these areas. But now we can see that unprecedented, the number of, sanctions has been imposed on Russia is over 5,000, which is extremely high. And day by day, if you see, the numbers are increasing. So it is very difficult if, for example, if you don't have a proper system or a screening solution in place, it's difficult to find the needle in the haystack. So which really costs you not only from the monetary perspective, but from the reputational perspective as well.
And just to add to that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Julian.
No, go on, Greg.
I was going to say, just to add to that, the reputational focus with the situation that's been going on in Ukraine and in Russia has really been unprecedented. I think for the average person outside of maritime, the front page articles on which carriers are shipping to and from Russia, even those carriers that are not that are following the sanctions, they're shipping things that are allowed within sanctions. Even then, the reputational damage to them has been huge. There's been a lot of naming names on which companies are still willing to ship into and out of Russia and Russian allied countries. And that has, I think, put a lot more pressure on the Russian regime. And these sorts of things never move backwards. And I think one of the key pieces here is we're going to see that reputational focus becoming more and more of an area that people look at in the same way that people are now becoming more focused on environmental risks, picking your carrier based on how green they are, how they're able to meet high levels of environmental controls. We're going to start seeing that, I think, or not start seeing that, but that's going to continue to grow. And what's happened in Russia is really aggressively pushing forward the requirements for screening in the maritime space, like it wouldn't have happened, at least not as quickly, without the situation in Iran. Sorry,
it's basically
in Russia,
the same though. Environmental and the reputational risk, it all relates to the ESG aspect that companies are starting to look at from the social perspective of what's moral to do and what's safe to do morally. Who should I do business with, not on the legal level anymore.
I totally agree. I think Greg makes a great point there, Hiller, and something I was going to come back to on CR as well. But on that reputational issue, what we've seen for the first time ever, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, we've seen this self-sanctioning. So as well as this massive increase in actual regulatory implementation from governments, from organizations, you've had corporates and individuals just deciding themselves, we're not going to deal with Russia. You know, you had law firms shutting down in Moscow, not because they're sanctioned, not because they're regulatorily restricted from providing legal advice, just because they don't want, for their client-based reputational reasons, to be seen to be dealing with Russia. As you say, there's an awful lot of talk in the industry about how the future of green shipping and ESG concerns will start to focus the way in which the trade operates, and that consumers will start to drive. And actually, you know, owners and operators will see the benefit in that by consumers deciding we want our goods carried on this particular ship because we think we like its ESG credentials, and they'll pay a premium for that. They'll be prepared to do that. But equally, those that don't comply will get edged and edged and edged out of the market, and that's also true of reputational damage through sanctions. So you really need to be on top of where you are on this. And I'll give you just an anecdotal real case example in a second. But I was just going to say, to what CR's point, we were talking when we were preparing to meet together into this webinar about something we described as the risk pyramid or the risk triangle, about, you know, what's happening here. And I think we've got, if you picture a pyramid, at the top of that pyramid is maritime trade. And there's a lot of things in maritime trade that we all take for granted, you know, SPVs, you know, one ship owning companies, flags of convenience. There's nothing strange about that. It's just the way our trade operates. It doesn't make us think twice. But on the other two sides of that triangle, what you have happening now is you have regulators like OFAC looking at that system and thinking, come on, this isn't right. You know, this isn't the way we see the banking and financial institutions work. We're really worried about this. We don't really understand it, and it doesn't look right to us. So you see this increased regulation focusing on maritime trade and transport. And on the other side of the triangle, you've got the criminal activists that are seeing opportunities because of the way in which maritime operates. And just finally, there's an example. So we talk about this situation of why do you really need a really strong checking regime. I've had a case, I can talk about it in general terms, but where it was a Japanese owner on time charter, legitimate time charterer, legitimate orders to load cargo in a Black Sea port. Owner had done basic level due diligence, had gone beyond what an owner under a time charter would normally do, and said, well, just tell me a little bit about this sales chain. I know you're not going to tell me confidential information, but do I need to be worried here because it's a Black Sea port? Charter said, no, you don't need to be worried at all. Sales contract is between a buyer and seller, neither of whom are sanctioned at all. Ship starts to load. Midway through the loading operation, finds out that there's a problem in the sub-sale contract, something starting to go wrong in the sub-sale contract, and one of the parties in that sub-sale contract are a sanctioned entity. Ongoing case still. It's just a nightmare situation. Had that owner done the checks that are available to do, I query whether they would have done that. In fact, they've told me they would not have done the trade.
It reminds me of a case that we had here at Windward a few days ago. Actually, I'm not allowed to share any of the details, but it's actually coming from the government sector, which shows how this goes well beyond financial institutions now. That they asked us to help them with an investigation of a ship that they had a legitimate reason to believe that we're doing something illegal, but they had no way of connecting it to Russia. And then we went ahead and used our data with LexisNexis, third-party screening, and we were able to find a non-maritime owner that is connected to Russian entities. And that was their ground base to start the investigation on the vessel. Otherwise, there was nothing suspicious about the vessel, and they could have never have guessed it. It's another example of how this now goes well beyond into any maritime shipping player.
Yeah, so Hel, I just want to add something. So what Julian and Greg mentioned earlier on, it's customer onboarding is really, really important, because you do the CDD, you know, and then it's KYC, customer monitoring, you know, periodic review, and also enhanced due diligence. It's really important. So what I mean by that is one of the most important elements of the compliance program is customer onboarding. And this is the process by which I would say an organization, identifies, research and documents its customers, and it will really enables the expected nature of the relationship. So what I mean by that is onboarding, which is knowing your customer, basically requires, one time and periodic, due diligence functions. For example, you bring somebody on board, the person X might be, or the entity might be a good guy, a good person. You never know after a week or weeks what's going to happen. So this means the customer identification program, at the start of the relationship, and ongoing monitoring and periodic review functions and enhanced due diligence for high-risk customers are really, really important, especially, for example, the current situation or regime of the sanctions. So one challenge from my experience, what I've seen, and I'm sure, Craig and Julian can share, is that in customer onboarding is dealing with naming conventions. What I mean that is that many people use different versions of their names or have names that are shared by others. So this can cause problems, for financial institutions, organization, investigators, and also for individuals themselves. So say, for example, if you want to have an effective sanctions compliance program, obviously you need to have the basics covered. So you need to have the appropriate lists. You need to screen all the relevant fields, and you need to ensure that you're getting all the data. For example, on a daily basis, lots of entities, individuals' names remove, modify, add by well-known, regulatory lists like OFAC, EU, UN, HMT, and also MAS, and some other names. So it's not easy, to maintain that list. So you need to have a good data in order to avoid, such kind of risk, which we call it finding the needle in the haystack. So you need to use what is called, fuzzy magic logic for your filters. The reason you use something like that is because of variations, in spelling of names in many places around the globe, or in Latin America, in the Middle East, in some, countries in Asia. So there can be, I would say, very significant, differences in how names are spelled and how that looks, in a payment messages. And if your filter is only looking for, literal matches, then you will miss something, and you can have a lot of exposure and a lot of risk if that's how you filtering messages. You need to have a fuzzy magic logic, and this is one of the reasons is that the partnership, with Windward, so the LexisNexis FERCO compliance link is providing an automated and comprehensive, anti-money laundering compliance solution, which provides a consolidated views of entities, dual-use goods, vessels, and ports, updated regulatory lists throughout the voyage life cycle. And what is really, really important also, it's making sure that the sanctions compliance, detecting financial crime and prepare, for the regulatory scrutiny, by keeping a complete audit trail of all screening, operations. So this is one of the points I just wanted to, bring into this webinar as well.
And I think one of the things that CR has mentioned here is the really key focus and requirement to go well beyond sanctions. We see every day institutions with a sanctions is enough attitude towards risk screening. And in the financial space, that's been unacceptable for decades. And in the maritime space, this is becoming unacceptable as well. Just this year, in fact, a couple of months ago, there was a case. The Homeland Security has been running a large operation called Operation Pengueros Locos. And this operation's goal was to reduce the amount of hard drugs, specifically cocaine, being trafficked between Central and South America into the United States. One of the arrests that they've been able to facilitate through this Operation Pengueros Locos was an arrest of a owner of multiple Ecuadorian flagged vessels. They found this man living in Spain, had him extradited to the US, and he was responsible for facilitating through his vessel ownership. I believe they were fishing vessels, but through this vessel ownership was able to identify those vessels and identify the routes that were being used to traffic cocaine into the United States. And so obviously using vessels for the trafficking of narcotics is nothing new, but we have the data now to be able to identify the individuals and entities who are responsible. From a risk mitigation perspective, this becomes a huge both reputational, regulatory, and financial risk to maritime companies. The risk of having your cargo seized, your vessels impounded, your crews arrested, having to deal with lawyers and government officials and governments around the world to have things released that you should or could have known about. And ignorance is not bliss in this sort of world. If your vessel is caught moving cocaine, moving narcotics, moving cash, large amounts of cash across borders, you are going to have, as a carrier, as an owner operator, as a freight forwarder, that is going to have a huge financial impact on your business, either by having to pay to get those things released, the legal fees associated, or simply loss of vessels that have been permanently impounded.
For sure. Talking about that, like taking it, Julie, my next question is you actually. Following what Greg said, you said a few days ago that we spoke that like the dynamic changes now create kind of a minefield for shipping stakeholders. What is the risk of not following that, of not navigating safely through this minefield in your expertise?
Thanks, Phil. I mean, that's a great question, and I think it really well follows on from what Greg said, because, yeah, I mean, what's going to happen to you, even as an innocent party, if it turns out that your vessel or you're somehow connected to a transaction, although being innocent, is related to illegal arms trade, illegal drugs trade, illegal money laundering, movement of currencies. And of course, what people will often say to that is, yeah, I accept that, but that's not me. I'm very careful. I'm never going to involve myself in any kind of criminal activity. Well, one point, unless you're checking and really checking very carefully now, you're exposed, as Greg said. But actually, even if you're in a position of being, totally and utterly innocent, the effect, the detrimental effect, the catastrophic detrimental effect of being on the wrong side of a sanctions breach is quite frankly horrendous. And I use this example. A lot of people on this webinar will have heard me use it before, and I only use it because I think it is a real actual example of the most innocent of operators, the most prudent of operators. This is the PB Tankers case. PB Tankers, Italian family, traded for hundreds of years, family owned, incredibly high principles, incredibly high integrity. I'm very honored to have worked for them for years and years and years. Are involved in a trade. They had, I think, 7 or 10 vessels at the time. And one of the vessels was trading to Venezuela. It was trading to Venezuela legitimately. The trade it was involved in was not sanctioned. And then suddenly what happens is there's a new executive order and that trade becomes a sanctioned trade. PB Tankers can't get themselves out of that contract. They're aware of that because they call me straight away to say, we've got a problem here. What do we do? The answer is, well, let's get out of that contract because it's now sanctioned. But that contract, that counterparty contract, did not have a sanctions provision in it. There was no legitimate legal way for us to get out of that contract without putting ourselves in repudiatory breach. Notwithstanding that, the owners, PB, were desperately speaking to the charterers saying, look, we can't do this anymore. It's going to expose us. What then happens overnight, without any notification, is PB are put on the STN list for every single vessel. Not only every single vessel that they've got, but some of these vessels are fully laden. They're coming into the States with petrochemical cargoes. They've also got projects where they manage vessels. They don't own them, but they're doing management. Suddenly, those vessels are on the SDN list. Within a matter of days, what's happened is their banks are refusing to deal with them. They can't pay the crews. They can't provide fresh water or supplies to the crews. Agents around the world are saying, look, I'm sorry, we can't come and assist you. We're saying to those agents, look, there's no sanctions restriction upon you, even though at the moment PB are on the SDN list and we're trying to get them off. And those third parties say, yeah, well, you say that, but we're not going to take the risk, because our bank have said to us that if you get involved with this company that's on an SDN list, well, we might have to look at whether you're in breach. And then their underwriters stop talking to them. Overnight, it destroys the company. And one of the problems there, we went in to speak to OFAC very quickly. And one of the first things that OFAC said to us was, okay, first thing we need to see your full due diligence system in relation to sanctions compliance. We didn't have one. We didn't have a formalized system. You know, we did check before fixing. It's a very prudent family. It works through regular brokers. It checks as far as anybody normal in maritime transport would check who they're going into charter with. But they couldn't give OFAC, okay, this is what we do. This is our due diligence system. We had to rebuild that and recreate it. And thankfully, OFAC took them off the list. But it was an absolute nightmare and catastrophic. And, you know, sitting watching that company and its employees just implode, totally and utterly innocent. Yeah, that was the effect of what happened.
Amazing. That really shows the importance of having a one unified system in place. I guess Greg can also say the same when we speak to our customers and even CR. It's a need that's very relevant today.
I think there's two things there. One is you've got to be doing this now because the regulatory burden is upon you, and for your own risk management, you've got to be doing this. But also, you need to be doing this because things change in shipping all the time. As CR was saying, you know, that what might be a know your client operation at the beginning of a transaction, a month, a week, you know, 2 months into that, something might change. You need to be able to demonstrate, if you get the call from the regulator, that you've got a system on what you were doing and how you were checking it. Sorry, Greg.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, what you talked about was absolutely key of understanding not just the direct ownership of the vessel, and not just understanding the direct sanctions, but there's the narrative sanctions, the sectoral sanctions, which can be difficult to identify, and you know, you need to make sure that you're accessing appropriate data to identify that, and then ensuring that you are, as you're chartering vessels, as you're engaging with new crews, new bunkering operations. You know, we've seen numerous cases of illicit bunkering off the coast of Africa, you know, where you know, stolen oil is used for bunkering operations. We've seen numerous cases, obviously, of piracy off what used to be off of the coast, the Horn of Africa, off the coast of Somalia, has now moved to the west of Africa. So those sorts of areas, being familiar with where you're traveling and where you're transporting your vessels, I think there we have a good feel from a maritime industry. Where we need to get much better is in making sure that we understand who are the ancillary players that we deal with. If you're transporting petroleum, you need to have a good view of everything from when that raw material comes out of the ground all the way through to where it goes to the final client, and all of those different operators in the interim. Where are they getting their oil? Where are you perhaps mixing your clean oil with oil from Venezuela, oil from Iran, as part of some sort of oil laundering scheme, for lack of a better term? I don't know that there is a better term than that. I think there's obviously a huge push in the industry to lower costs, to do things more effectively. Nothing will cost you more than having to go fight a legal battle in some part of the world. And I think part of the fact that we all in maritime work so globally, just by the nature of our work, is that you need to have a standard set of operating rules that you work with globally. You can't possibly have 100, 120 different rules for every country you travel into or out of.
That actually relates to a question we got from Omer, I think, that asked if maritime KYC and CDD procedures are standard, and if not, can they be standardized in your opinion? Which is,
I think that has been the dream of every bank and financial institution for since 1970. I wish that we could learn as the maritime industry, we could learn from their mistakes and do it better. I think the reality, however, is that each company, each institution, whether you're a freight forwarder, a carrier, a broker dealer, however you work within maritime, everyone's risks are unique. Whether you work predominantly in Southeast Asia or in the Middle East, maybe you're only Pacific Islands, South America, each of these parts of the world is going to be unique to your business, the type of crews that you hire, the type of goods that you transport, whether you work in chemicals or in bulk goods or in containerized goods, your risk associated with things like export controls and the Commerce Control List. All of these things, unfortunately, are just not going to be standardized. I think where we will see more standardization, we've seen this in the financial markets as well, is the types of individuals that need to be screened. I should say individuals and entities. So we're going to see a much bigger push on screening crews, screening dock workers and organizations, trucking companies and truckers involved with the movement of goods, other vessel owners, all of the 7 types of ownership of vessels, beneficial owners, register owners, ISM managers, technical managers, controllers, operators, ensuring that you understand how those companies are related to each other and how they may be related to sanctioned entities. I think we'll see some standardization there. Obviously on implementation, things will be different from organization to organization, and then how far and how often you screen. We track hundreds of thousands of vessels and vessel direct ownership companies. And there are everything from small companies that own, a family that owns a couple of fishing vessels off the coast of Taiwan, all the way to, MSC and Maersk and everything in between. And so the complexity of this world makes standardization very, very difficult.
I just want to add something on Greg and based on the Omar question. So we have like a scenario called risk-based approach, where every organization take, the geography, the customers, the product and services. So they divide them in 3 areas and see, because every organization risk differs. And as I mentioned earlier on, the sanction advisory is changing over the maritime industry. And this means the organizations, they really need to make sure, to have appropriate, systems in place, because you're taking a lot of risk if you do all these steps, manually, because you might miss the needle in the haystack. And many people use, it's really, really important that you need to, the customer should be screened at the start of the process to determine if they are a match to one of the names on a list issued by any jurisdiction or international body or institution subject to OFAC EU. So sanction lists and the requirements of sanctions regimes are constantly changing, and institutions must update, accordingly. And in terms of the CDD and KYC, as per the recommendation number 10, as I mentioned to you, from the FARA Financial Action Task Force, which a lot of other organizations, if it's financial institutions or non-financial institutions, they take those recommendations practice. It depends, to every organization risk appetite, and policy and procedures.
Just adding to what Greg and Ciara said there, not only do we suffer as an industry, but not just our industry, but across the board in relation to, there isn't a single system, there isn't a defined system in relation to KYC, CDD operations, but also in relation to the application of the regimes themselves. They're all very different. So the approach of OFSI in the UK to OFAC in the States to the EU regulators, Sometimes it's the same, sometimes there are slight differences. So knowing how to be in compliance with which one and what each regulator requires is a minefield. And you know, we've had some experiences that not only do we as lawyers and our clients who are very involved in the maritime transport operations have difficulties interpreting what the sanctions regulations mean. Even the regulators do. Give you a crazy example. We had a Greek vessel which was in Ukraine, and decided for various reasons that what was required there was an application to the regulator, whoever that regulator might be, in relation to permission to move the cargo. She's a Greek vessel. She's going to Greece. So it's an EU regulatory issue. So, you know, there's not $1 million question to think, well, the person to go to is the Greek regulator. So we went to the Greek regulator. We were bounced around about 12 different departments. And finally, the Greek regulator said, we think you should ask Ukraine. It's just, you know, it's really, really difficult.
So I think that's why also unifying, having all in one system, one platform, like we did here with the partnership with LexisNexis, can really help not standardize the process, but definitely make it much easier.
100%. And I think that is, you know, ensuring that you get that, integrate your maritime and non-maritime view, because nothing ends at the water's edge. None of our companies start or stop once we dry our feet off. And so that becomes a very, very key area, is looking, you know, so much we think of ourselves as maritime businesses. And so we think of what happens in the open ocean, how are we transacting there? And we need to look sort of beyond that for identifying risk. One thing that's very interesting about this space is where sanctions interacts with non-sanctioned risk. So there are obviously a number of vessels, there's some in the order of, before the Ukrainian-Russian situation, there were fewer than 500 vessels that were sanctioned globally, with about half of those not active. Obviously, that number has increased significantly over the last 3 or 4 months, with global sanctions against Russia. But where we see a lot of risk is not necessarily the individuals and entities who are directly sanctioned. Those are relatively easy to find. But uncovering those individuals, you know, the ones that I mentioned earlier, involved in narcotics trafficking, that guy is going to go to jail. At some point, he'll be released, and he will most likely go back to what he knows, which is trafficking narcotics. These sorts of career criminals, these sophisticated criminals, they'll learn from their mistakes. They'll try to do better next time, but it's unlikely that they're going to leave jail or prison and say, okay, well, now I want to go become a farmer or something. They're going to continue doing what they know, which is trafficking in narcotics. I think there's another piece of this that we should say, sort of note on, is that some of these crimes that we've seen related to shipping over the last decade or so have a huge, huge human cost. There have been numerous cases over the last 10 years of specifically women and girls being trafficked in shipping containers, often from Southeast Asia to the United States, for the purpose of sexual slavery and human trafficking. This has been something, both when I worked on the financial side, we had banks who would come to us and say, hey, because we screened properly, we knew that this guy was fishy. We had the FBI go and called the FBI. His property was raided, and they saved, you know, dozens of women and girls from sexual slavery. And so I think we often think of this as a very business-related, financially related crime, related process, which it is. But there's a huge, huge human toll that we as part of the maritime industry can help to prevent. At any given time, just to put it in numbers for the audience here, at any given time in the United States, there are 600,000 people being held in slavery. That's in the United States alone. Percentages across the world are about 0.5% of the population of a country. Well, I guess that's not 0.5%, less than 0.5%, are held either for forced marriages, human trafficking related to sexual exploitation, or other human slavery. And so the movement of those people, and the vast majority of those people, first of all, are women and girls, and the vast majority of those people are trafficked from other countries. And the movement of those people is often through shipping containers, through other maritime related movements. And so part of this as well, outside of screening the vessels you work with, the people you work with, being sure they're not tied to any of these crimes, is obviously putting processes in place to make sure that you know what's going on to your vessels.
Greg, I think you've answered a big question there. We come into these webinars. One of the things we ask ourselves, or we try to address for our audiences, is why should I do this? Why should I, why do I need to up my game on compliance? And we've talked about the risk scenario and the exposure scenario, but the other one is it's this obligation. Shipping, one of the great things about shipping is it's for many years before regulation came in, as the way it is now, we were a self-regulated industry. The reason that the amount of casualties has reduced considerably is because the industry self-regulated itself. It was the industry that came up with separation lanes. It was the industry and the P&I clubs that came up with procedures to stop seafarers dying in enclosed spaces. Equally now, with the obligation concerning regulatory compliance, we really need to work together. That's why all of us, work together on projects, because we need to develop systems that can answer this regulatory burden. And partly that's about, making international maritime trade, feasible and economic, and helping those engaged in the trade to operate around the difficulties that they face, which have an economic impact, just because of the efforts they have to put in to ensure that they're compliant, but also the exposure they face if something goes wrong. But it's much bigger than that, as you've said. It's in order to deal with this raising problem of international crime, which has started to really focus on the maritime industry. It's always been there, but at the moment, maritime is really being seen as a sector to facilitate criminal activity. And it's only by sharing stories, upping our game on compliance, working together, that we can improve this system.
That leads me to think, like, where do you see it developing and evolving from here? Following on what you said, that we're trying to work together and self-standardize and self-regulate, like, what's the next step for maritime due diligence?
You're not turning the clock back. Nobody should be under any illusion that this degree of scrutiny is going to roll back. It's not going to roll back. It's going to increase. For many years, the maritime sector wasn't under the microscope. It now is, and that's not going to change. We're going to see increased regulatory burden. I think what we've got to see there is therefore a development of systems, streamlining, so that we can eradicate both the risks, the potential financial disruption and exposure, but also take away the risk of improper and illegal trade.
I couldn't agree more. I think we're going to, this sort of screening that Windward is doing with the partnership with LexisNexis, this type of screening, sanctions, politically exposed persons, which I don't think we've talked about much today, state-owned enterprises, ensuring that what you're screening is not directly, or sorry, what you're shipping is not related to ill-gotten gains from oligarchs, from other government entities, as well as looking at adverse media and enforcement data well beyond sanctions to understand the risk of what you're shipping is going to become an absolute standard. I agree 100% with Julian that the clock is not going to turn back here. We're going to see the requirement to screen become more and more solidified over the next few years. And I think for those on the line, for those people involved in the shipping industry, getting started now is going to be a lot easier, and being able to deploy this solution, test it out, see what works for you, sort of kick the tires on, or maybe kick the anchor for the maritime people, and try to get that process in place is going to be a lot easier, more cost-effective today than it will be in a year or two from now, when this stuff becomes a regulatory and legal requirement, when the pressure is really on. It's much easier to go to the regulator and say, we have a process in place, here's what works for us, is this good? It's much easier to do that than to go to the regulator and say, we have nothing. What do we need to do? And so starting today, rolling this out in anticipation for what what today is required from a reputational and financial aspect, but will soon be required from a government regulatory aspect as well.
I agree. When we have time for one question that I think relates to what you just said, that people want to act now, but someone asked us that surely a lot of this information is available on the web and anyone can just go and download the sanctions list. So why do they need a third-party provider or solution to get prepared for what we just discussed?
You know, this has a lot to do with how many people do you want to throw at the problem and how efficient do you want to be? If you want to go hire 50,000 people to go search through every sanction list, every website in 100 different languages, every government regulatory site, looking through PDFs and other documents, you want to go hire an army of people to do that, you know, go ahead. I think the real point here is that we don't have, and I assume no one on the call here has unlimited resources to do compliance. Compliance is never given huge budgets, and so we need to be cost effective. And the biggest area of cost for compliance is personnel. And so by being efficient, by working across your maritime and non-maritime risk, by using data sources that are sourced and extracted in a easy to understand, easy to interrogate manner, is where you'll be able to intersect risk mitigation with budgets, with resources, with allowed resources. And that ends up being really where those two things intersect, is where companies are the most efficient.
And also, is another point I would like to add, that it's all about the transparency. It's all about the efficiency, and what is really, really important is explanatory for the regulators, you know, because you need to really show them. For example, I know that everybody can pull, you know, the sanction list from the OFAC, EU, HMT, but how do you actually really maintain that? How are you really going to update that? Because on a daily basis, you see addition, modification, removal, you know, and if you miss a single hit, that's going to cost your organization. On top of it, you know, the partnership that we have with Windward. So with LexisNexis, we are not only providing these lists, but also we have got, you know, the enhancement list. What I mean by that is that we leverage our payments data. So we add the bank, routing codes, ownership information, location, vessels. So basically we really enhance, you know, these lists, which means, you know, is finding the needle in the haystack. And why I'm just giving this example each time, because obviously the most important thing is not to have just for formality, the solution and data. Yeah. But what's really, really important is how to catch or how to mitigate, you know, your risk by having, you know, a good data and solution, you know, and top of it as well, you're just actually moving from manual, which is quite risky. And I know that a lot of governments at the moment, they're actually pressurizing, and they're actually making mandatory for the financial institutions, organizations, to move from manual entry into automation, because it's not anymore, you know, acceptable. They just want to make sure, you know, transparency again. You know, they just want to make sure the audit trail is always there. So make, you know, the life much easier.
Yeah.
Two quick comments from me just to endorse what Ciara and Greg have said. English law concept that many people may know in relation to sale of goods is this thing called caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. You need to be careful who you're buying these systems with and who you're taking your advice from. When the Gulf of Aden piracy issue first came to light, suddenly everybody was a piracy expert. Everybody could, you know, advise on piracy. And you know what? People lost their lives because of that, because there were one or two or perhaps three at the most organizations in the world that really did understand how to deal with hostage negotiations and dealing with hostages. So you need to be talking to the right people, because a little bit of information is a dangerous thing. The other reason why, yeah, you can pull things off the internet is don't reinvent the wheel, folks. you know, what the people, you know, the people on this call, the people that deal with these kind of inquiries now, every time we do one of these, we learn a little bit more. We find a connection in OFAC. We talk to OFAC and we win some confidence with them. We speak to a regulator. We find answers. If you're doing this from scratch every time you do it, you're starting from scratch every single time. You know, what we've got to do is work together to build a system that makes this just a much more streamlined operation. So that's why it's far better not to just try and do it yourself.
For sure. I want to be time conscious of our of the people on the webinars, so we have to stop. But thank you very much, Greg, CR, and Julian. It was a pleasure. I'm going to send my email on the chat. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to reach out, and I'll make sure that our experts get you the answer. Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.